Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Atlantic World Art Fair online program for 2022. We are delighted that you are able to join us and spend some time with us. Today, as part of our series of online engagements, we're focusing on women in photography. And the intention of our program is to develop understanding of and appreciation for Atlantic Caribbean contemporary art. And to do so, we are exploring institutional and alternative approaches to regional art practices while making connections between the past, present, and future. I'm delighted that we have this focused topic on women in photography, and ideally that this becomes a series of conversations that we continue to explore from one fair to the next. It gives me great pleasure to introduce your moderator for today, Aldeide Delgado. She is a Cuban-born, Miami-based, independent Latinx art historian and curator. She's the founder and director of Women Photographers International Archive, also known as WOPHA. And Delgado studies and publishes on and curates from feminist and decolonial perspectives on crucial topics of the history of photography and abstraction within Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx contexts. Notably, she has lectured on the significance and subversive nature of international women photography collectives and marginalized identities in the arts at the Tate Modern, the Paris Art Museum, Miami, DePaul Art Museum, King's College London, California Institute of the Arts, and the New School. Delgado is a recipient of the 2019 Knight's Arts Challenge Award by the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the 2018 School of Art Criticism Fellowship by SAPS La Telera, and a 2017 Research and Production of Critic Essay Fellowship by Tiera. I'm not sure if I pronounced that properly. Prior to founding WOPHA, Delgado created the online feminist archive catalog of Cuban women photographers, the first comprehensive survey of Cuban photography history, highlighting women's contributions from the 19th century to the present. Honestly, bravo. She is an active member of PAM's International Women's Committee and PAM's Latin American and Latinx Art Fund, U.S. Latinx Art Forum, and the steering committee of the Feminist Art Coalition and, fast forward, Women in Photography. I'm so glad that we were able to grab you because you read a bio like that. So, okay, well, hold on. Does she have any time? Can we get you? So I had the pleasure of enjoying WOPHA from a distance online, really wishing I'd been able to meet you in person, and I look forward to that happening at some time, universe. Thank you. And so Aldeide, I really want to pass it on to you. I know we have a packed panel and look forward to learning from you. So thank you so much for your time and sharing.
Thank you so much, Lisa, for the invitation to organize this panel. And thank you also to the Atlantic World Art Fair team for all the logistic support while we organize this conversation. I want to thank the panelists who are joining me today, three amazing women that I highly respect and feel inspired about their work, which we will learn a little bit in the next hour through their presentations. And please, we will have some time at the end for questions. So if you have any, write them in the comment sections. I want to start this panel on women and photography from the Caribbean region with some ideas that have defined my research during the last year. And specifically, I refer to this notion of remapping photography history from a feminist archipelagic perspective. But what does it mean, archipelagic perspective? For Caribbean philosopher and poet Edward Glissant, the archipelagic thinking engaged with exchange, fluids, mobility, and border crossings, and challenged the continental imaginary that perceives islands as fragmented and isolated. Through archipelagic thinking, we see the world metaphorically as a collection of islands connected to each other. In my practice as an art historian and curator, I use the archipelagic perspective as an analytical framework to interrogate epistemologies, ways of thinking, and methodologies. My practice is informed by writings of scholars such as Tatiana Flores, Nelson Maldonado Torres, Michelle Stephens, Yolanda Martinez San Miguel, who have been addressing archipelagic studies as a methodology through which to explore different disciplines. An archipelagic perspective within a decolonial feminist lens, and I quote this notion from author Yomar Yomaira, entangled histories and affective connections that would otherwise be obscured by dominant and truncated narratives. A feminist archipelagic perspective centers racialized women's experiences and foregrounds the aftermath of the abyss, as I said in the current exhibition, the abyss of the ocean, that is where that is online, and you all are invited to see the abyss of the ocean, organized for by the Caribbean Cultural Center of the African Diaspora Institute. And well, the main idea is how this feminist archipelagic perspective foregrounds the aftermath of the abyss, of the slave ship, of the depths of the sea, and of the unknown, that is the colonial wound. So it's with this theoretical framework that I want to start the conversation today, and I want to introduce the panelists of this session. And I will say their names and read their bios in the order of how they will present. And the first one is Nadia Huggins, who is a visual artist and a visual artist from San Vicente and the Grenadines, who works primarily with photography. Her work merged documentary and conceptual practices to explore identity, memory, and belonging through the landscape and the sea. Her work has been exhibited in Human Stories, Circa, No Future, in Now Gallery, UK, Relational Undercurrents, Art of the Caribbean Archipelago, an exhibition that was presented in several places across the US, A Love Ethic, in which contemporary curatorial projects in Canada, Addis Photo Fest in Ethiopia, the Jamaica Biennial in Jamaica, among many other places. She's the co-founder of Arc Magazine and One Drop in the Ocean, an initiative that aims to raise awareness about marine debris. She's also a 2022 WOPHA artist in residence, and we are working together on her upcoming exhibition that will take place in September in Miami. I also welcome Nadia.
Thank you, Aldeide.
I also want to introduce Grace Aneiza Ali, who is an esteemed colleague and curator and assistant professor in the departments of art and art history at Florida State University in Tallahassee, Florida. Her curatorial research and teaching practices center on curatorial activism, art and social justice, art and migration, global contemporary art, and art of the Caribbean diaspora with a focus on her homeland, Guyana. Ali serves as curator at large for the Caribbean Cultural Center African Diaspora Institute in New York. She is an Andy Warhol Foundation for the Visual Arts Curatorial Fellow and Fulbright Scholar. Her essays on contemporary art have been published in Asian Diasporic Visual Cultures and the Americas, Wasafari, Harvard Transition Magazine, Small Acts, and Nueva Luz Photographic Journal. And her recent book, Liminal Spaces, Migrations and Women of the Guyanese Diaspora, explores the art and migration narratives of women of Guyanese heritage. Ali was born in Guyana and migrated to the US when she was 14 years old. And I also, it's a pleasure to introduce Tiera Ndlovu, who is a Bahamian South African art historian living and working in South Florida. She is a graduate with honors from Emory University and experienced independent researcher. Tiera also is the founder of Baja Archives, a virtual archive dedicated to celebrating lesser-known histories of the Bahamas through inspiring historical photography. Tiera also serves as curatorial assistant at the Norton Museum of Art in West Palm Beach, Florida, where she recently curated the exhibition Origin Stories, Photography of Africa and its Diaspora, that features the work of artists living and working on the African continent and throughout the diaspora from the Norton's photographic collection. Thank you so much for being here and joining us in this panel. And I want to, give the, pass the time to speak to Nadia.
Okay. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Aldeide. It's really nice to be a part of this panel with the three of you, sorry. Well, I think, well, if I can get my presentation up on the screen, then I can just get right into it. So I was invited to speak a little bit about the activism work that I've been doing, which I've kind of organically stumbled into through my practice. But just to kind of give a little bit of framework and background to some of the projects that most of you might be a bit familiar with, to kind of create a bit of context so you can understand how I've kind of made my way into doing this work. Not, like I said, not necessarily intentionally, but how a practice can kind of take you into that sort of trajectory with your work. So, I kind of found my way into, I guess, environmental activism, or dealing with sort of environmental themes or being interested in that because of my interest in working in the ocean, which technology has pretty much afforded me the opportunity to do. 10 years ago, I couldn't imagine being in the water with a camera doing what I'm doing now. So it's been really just kind of a joy having that opportunity to be curious about what's out there and sort of look at my island, my life, my experiences through a different lens, so to speak. So in 2014, I started documenting, these young boys that you would typically see on beaches, jumping off of boats or jetties or rocks or whatever young teenage boys tend to do. But I was really interested in kind of capturing that moment of them sort of returning to this sort of state of vulnerability. If you can switch to the next slide. Like this is a kind of a very performative moment that we're all very familiar with, seeing boys posturing themselves in a particular way and performing for someone. But I suppose, one of the interesting things about this project to me, and it always kind of goes back, yes, I have the experience of doing these things as well, but them encountering me in the ocean has kind of blurred my gender in some ways, because I'm like bald, and when I'm approaching them they see me as a boy, so there's a kind of a interaction that we tend to have for like a very brief moment, which gives you a kind of a access and a snippet into somebody else's world when they have their guard down, so to speak. But these kind of moments are more performative, obviously, once they realize that I'm a woman, then that they're showing off like teenage boys do. But that brief moment of accessibility, of seeing another part of them, was what really interested me. And if you switch to the next slide, so I kind of became interested in that sort of transformative moments of their vulnerability and their playfulness, and just sort of showing a different side to masculinity, where like these young boys are not necessarily performing their gender because they're so removed from these constructs of what exists on the land. They don't have to play the same game that we all do on the land. So that really sort of interested me, and for a number of years I documented these kind of moments. And also it's just like trying to represent Caribbean people in a space that we live in, we exist in. A lot of the imagery that we see coming out of these sort of seascapes, underwater scenes, are like kind of driven by a very tourism perspective. So it's either like scuba divers or just kind of scientific documentation of marine life. And a lot of times, like, Caribbean people are sort of invisible in that narrative, unless they're performing certain roles, like the fisherman, or like again, like the young boy jumping for a coin, like these sort of like images of the Caribbean being replicated over and over. So I kind of wanted to show a futuristic image in some ways, but it's something that has always been there. We just never had the technology to see it in quite this way. And I enjoy being in these spaces, and it's like just an opportunity for me to really explore and look at things from a different perspective. You can switch to the next slide. So like a lot of my work, I actually blur people's identities, because that's also very much a part of my practice. Like, I've been just thinking a lot about the ethics of photography and how Caribbean people have been documented in the past and present, and like what is the intention behind the image? Like, how can you maintain the essence of a person in an image while maintaining some level of anonymity, because not everybody is necessarily comfortable being shown in a particular way. It is a kind of a vulnerable moment, and you want to be able to like respect people's space as well, but while still giving a viewer access to that world. So like a lot of my images do play with that kind of notion of maintaining that anonymity. So you'll see like a lot of people either being blurred by bubbles, or if they're on the land, that I hide them behind trees. But the idea is really to kind of show people in these spaces in nature in a way that, the viewer is aware that Caribbean people do exist in these spaces in a particular way. We're not just there performing, we're authentically living our lives, doing regular things like everyone else. So this series was really a kind of a foundational way for me to think about the body in nature, and the way I photograph people, also just like how I build relationships over time. Next slide. So simultaneously, while I was documenting these boys, I just got really excited because obviously it's like a new camera, and I've just been like shooting everything while I was out there. And I spent some time. I started also documenting my own body, so just like doing my own sort of performance underwater and like photographing different parts of my body within the limitations of doing that underwater. But also I was really sort of interested in just, this is a beach that I grew up on, so I had sort of seen this reef sort of die and come back to life throughout different periods of my life. And I wanted to basically document that process over a period of time. So I spent maybe like about 4 years or so, just like in detail documenting all the reefs, all the marine organisms that I knew. Like a lot of the coral that you see, like they're not necessarily all beautiful. Like some of it can be quite ugly, but that's also just a part of it. Like trying to like see everything for what it is, and create a record of a span of time, where something important is happening, even if it's on a very small scale. So these images really kind of started off in that way, and through this kind of accidental combination of trying to merge these two worlds, I created this series called the Transformation Series, which is 11 images that merge my body and different marine organisms together. So you can go to the next slide. Most of the images are in my head, but there are moments where it's also like a piece of my shoulder, or my knuckles, or different parts of my body that I can actually physically photograph by myself. But it does sort of show again this sort of tension between two worlds trying to become one, like how we live in relation to the environment. Like a lot of people, when they speak about this work, they talk about blurring of gender and everything. Yes, these things are present in the work, but it wasn't my primary focus when I had started the work. There's a kind of a playfulness to it, like kind of referencing our carnival culture, like trying to embody the environment in a very particular way that's like playful, and a little bit mischievous. And it's, again, like I said, 11 images in the series, and they basically show that kind of relationship with the body, and this like underwater world. Next slide. The other thing that I kind of became interested in with these particular images is just the way, again, like in the image of the Caribbean person, and the image of the Caribbean environment, there's a way that we kind of try to negate certain experiences, or tailor things in a very particular way for a tourism market. So certain types of coral, or like the black urchin, for example, is something that's not necessarily a desirable creature that you want to encounter in the sea. So you won't necessarily put that in a tourism ad, like. So there's a way that we also invisibilize like multi-species, and even like bodies of color, or like certain gender, or like certain types of experiences. And these images really try to just like confront that in some ways, and be like, this is what exists, and you're just gonna have to kind of deal with it. It's not gonna fit into your idea of what the Caribbean necessarily is in that sense. Next slide. So kind of going now into activism, and this jumps forward to last year. In between all of that, a lot of things have happened. There's a pandemic. St. Vincent went through a volcanic eruption in April last year. And, all of these things kind of accumulating and, changing a lot of the work that I've been doing and how I think about my practice. And yeah, it's like a lot of emotion that got involved. And I think as a result of that, like my work has taken on a lot more of a kind of a social interest in protecting the environment, like actively protecting the environment. And, in spite of all that, developers develop, they spend money, they don't really care. Like disaster capitalism happens, like all these things are always going to be present in the Caribbean. And so the beach that I've been documenting, there was a development project happening with a hotel that was bought. And the developers pretty much wanted to rip out a reef directly in front of their development so they can make a nice sandy patch that would be desirable for tourists to swim. It'll section off the beach from a lot of the local community. There was a lot of issues around it, and they very sneakily put this thing out in the papers saying that they were going to remove this reef. They used like an alternative name and all sorts of stuff. Typical story. Not really asking anybody if this is what they wanted, just making assumptions about us. And I think, a friend of mine kind of alerted me to it, and obviously it raised a red flag for me. The environmental assessment that they did, the person who was responsible for it didn't get into the water. They didn't do any proper assessment, really. They didn't get a marine biologist. They didn't have a valid way of assessing if this reef was dead or not. They just sort of looked at it from the shore and made an assumption. It's like, well, it's just a bunch of dead rocks. And I think that's also very typical of a lot of things, the way we approach the environments that we don't know. We just look at things at face value and just make assumptions and then go ahead and do things without understanding the consequences of it. But because I had this detailed record of images that I had been photographing for my own work, it somehow became like this hard evidence of them not telling the truth. And of course, I couldn't just sit back and look at them destroy my home in this way. Like I had to find a way to at least like mobilize people to get them to push back against that. So, I had like all these images from the coral pieces that I had been doing. For some strange reason, I'm just like a person who's incredibly detailed when it comes to shooting. So, I had like GPS coordinates, date, time, depth, everything that they could have potentially challenged and claimed to be a lie. Like it was all there technically in the image. And I was able to sort of like put together a document to submit to planning, able to share these images with people and let them know this is what was happening. And it really stirred up a lot of emotions in people, which I wasn't expecting, to be honest, because, like the arts and the environment are kind of two things that always gets pushed aside in our societies for whatever reason. But for what, it stirred up a lot because it is a beach that was culturally important to people. A lot of locals use it, every day. And even though, the idea of having a nice sandy patch to swim in sounds enticing, people are not stupid. They know the long-term consequences of destroying something like that. You're thinking of like coastal erosion. You're thinking of like, depleting our fish population, things that we all depend on to sustain our livelihood. At the end of the day, sure, a hotel development is wonderful and can bring in jobs and all this kind of stuff. But, most of these projects that come to the Caribbean in a couple of years, we find out somebody's involved in some fraudulent activity, the hotel goes under, and then suddenly we're like left with a beach that's no longer protected. And, we're kind of trying to grapple with coming to terms with that. So next slide. So, yeah, I mean, we were able to mobilize enough people and, not even just locally, but regionally, a lot of people in the diaspora were really passionate about it. And we managed to get the application refused. And, it was a kind of a tremendous moment for me because it was the first time I could actually see the work that I was doing, even for my own artistic practice, come into to play in a much more valuable way that could influence the development of our society. And yeah, that it felt like an important moment, and it really kind of had me thinking about like how how to approach my work in the future. I don't necessarily want to be out in the streets with a picket, championing for everything. But definitely, I think the image has a way that it can carry power just through hard evidence and meticulous documentation of whatever you're doing, even if you're doing very conceptual work. I think the lesson I've learned from that is just to not discard anything. It might seem useless in the final image, the final conceptual image, but the process of all of that can come into play at some other point in your life. You just have to figure out where your values lie. Next slide. Actually, next slide. I think I'm not sure how long I'm already speaking for. I feel like I might be speaking on. So again, like backtracking to the volcanic eruption that happened, I had been doing a lot of work with the Seismic Research Center, just building hazard maps and making the communities in the red zones aware of this eruption that was going to happen. And again, that was another kind of intersection between like just doing design work, working with the community in a very particular way, but then using that as a kind of a foundation to even just fuel my own practice. So I started documenting the eruption that had happened last year. But I like thinking of the type of imagery that comes out of natural disasters. There's a lot of disaster porn that we see every time there's a hurricane or earthquake or whatever that's happening in the Caribbean. It's always very centered around the pain and suffering, and that there's that sort of like narrative that always comes up. And it's not to say that those things don't exist, but it becomes the main sort of focus of a natural disaster. It's less about the personal experiences of people. It's less about the environment changing, because at the end of the day, it's interesting that we refer to these things as disasters when in truth and fact nature is just unfolding the way it's meant to. We just happen to be there. A hurricane system happening out in the Atlantic is just that. It's just a system that's making its way to land. But at the minute it kind of comes into contact to us, it then becomes this whole kind of problematic thing. And yes, of course, we have to think about how we prepare for these things and how we design our homes and all of this stuff. But for me, I was just kind of really interested in documenting that process from a personal experience, negating the pain and suffering, and really just sort of looking at the environment for what it is. Next slide, please. So, again, like just sort of looking at the details, because, even when we think about disasters, I had no idea what to expect. The scientists were saying there's going to be a lot of ash falling, and I didn't even quite understand like what ash looked like, what it felt like. It's basically like, imagine picking up a handful of concrete. This is pretty much what it is. And for me, I wanted to be able to create a record for future generations to understand what to expect, because volcanoes will erupt again in the future. Our volcano will erupt in another 30 to 40 years. So getting people prepared for that in a very realistic way, instead of just focusing on images that might not necessarily be helpful to us. Next slide, please. So yeah, this is also another moment of just like, again, like disrupting that cliche of the palm leaves in the Caribbean being on this like white sandy beach, and like looking at this kind of other reality that unfolds in nature, where you have sort of ash falling, and eventually these things obviously become very fertile, but in the moment it's like disrupting our day-to-day lives. Next slide, please. So
Nadia, sorry.
I went on for too long. I figured, yeah.
I don't want to interrupt you, but yeah, if you can go quickly through these other images,
I have two.
So we have the Q&A. Okay, thank you.
Sorry, guys. Yeah, so again, like just thinking of natural disasters, and I got invited to do this residency in Haiti in December. and they wanted me to create a series of images, working with women in that capacity, and obviously going through a volcanic eruption, thinking about Haiti being a site having earthquakes, and just thinking about the geological changes happening in the Caribbean. I created these images. Next slide, please. And yeah, this is a more recent body of work, again, sort of like referencing the older images with the transformation coral heads. But my kind of interest was like building an ecosystem of creatures that are sort of adapting to these environmental changes. So again, working with the diptych format, but thinking of them more like plate tectonic, so like referencing this idea of like geological changes without being explicit about the disaster and the suffering. So yeah, that's that's where I am now. Sorry for going on so long.
Thank you so much. I love the presentation. And then let's go quickly with Grace, who is the next one.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Aldeide. So I thought I would share with you all, use my time to share with you all just some of the projects that I've been working on to really elevate and in a way be a bit of a fangirl of all of these amazing Guyanese women that are thinking of photography in very wonderful, beautiful ways. And for this morning, I thought I'd share with you the work that I've been doing in terms of my book and my exhibition projects that feature Guyanese women that are largely thinking about the intersection of photography and their migration narratives. So I gathered about 15 Guyanese women 2 years ago. We made this book called Liminal Spaces that looks at the art and migration narratives of Guyanese women that are both based in Guyana, but of course equally important in the diaspora of the United Kingdom and Canada and here in the States. And it was a very multidisciplinary project, so it's very much a visual feast, but it's also full of poetic responses, curatorial essays, and memoir essays. So I wanted to think very interdisciplinary about the project. And so two of the photographers I'll share with you. The first one is Khadija Ben, and she's based in Guyana, and she's has a training as a geographer and spends a lot of time in Guyana's indigenous regions and made this beautiful series called Those Who Remain on these beautiful, in Guyana we say Amerindian, in the States they say indigenous. So when I say Amerindian, that's what I'm saying. It's beautiful Amerindian elders, and I'll scroll through just a few of them and then back. And really what she was attempting to convey in this photo essay, Liminal Spaces, is this notion of when we talk about migration, and this is very important to my work, we largely focus on the people that do the leaving. But migration is a double-edged journey. There's an arc to it, and it's about the people who leave, but it's also about the people who are left. And my work is largely thinking about what are the stories and the experiences and the emotional journey of the people that are left, and that must remain. And so the series looks at these beautiful indigenous grandmothers and mothers who have seen their children, their grandchildren, in some cases their great-grandchildren, leave Guyana, but they stay, and they choose to stay or they can't leave, and what that experience is like for them. The second photographer I wanted to share from the book is Keisha Scarville and her beautiful series Mama's Clothes. And Keisha's based in the States, but at the untimely passing of her mother, who was Guyanese born, Keisha packed a suitcase of her mother's clothing and went back to the hometown of her mother in Buxton, Guyana, and would make these beautiful portraits embodied in her mother's clothing. And it's a beautiful way to think about how we mourn both a mother and a motherland simultaneously. So those are just two of the projects, two of the photographers in the book. The book was inspired by an exhibition of the same name, Liminal Space, and this was mounted at the Caribbean Cultural Center in New York, where I'm curator at large, as Aldeide mentioned. And it largely focused on photographers that were thinking about the migration experience between Guyana and the United States. And this is a work, photography collage by Dominique Hunter, who's also based in Guyana. And she's using this beautiful notion of transplantation in a sort of ecology, gardening sense, and responding to this sort of missive that she was given, that as a photographer and artist who chooses to remain in a country like Guyana, that she would be compromising her artistic practice. So she really wants to use her practice and her photography to engage this idea, again, of what it means to stay in a place and to forge an artistic practice in a place that largely everyone tells you to leave. This is the work of Christy Neptune, who is based in Brooklyn. Christy was thinking a lot about migration and labor among Guyanese women. And this is a series on a lovely elder in Brooklyn who migrated to the United States in the 1960s or 1970s, I believed, and is now retired and spent her entire time working as a home care worker. It is now reflecting on what it means to have left a country to come to another country that has largely been enveloped by labor and work. This is an installation shot of Christy's work at the Caribbean Cultural Center. And then the last project I'll talk about is this project Unfixed Homeland, which I received the Andy Warhol Curatorial Fellowship to mount, which is really, really important, and it was put up at a beautiful space, Aldeide, in Newark, New Jersey. And it brought together everyone. It brought together Guyanese folks from the United Kingdom, the United States, Canada, and of course, Guyana to around this conversation of migration. And this is a Toronto-based photographer and artist, Erica DeFreitas, who I had to show you this picture because this is her fly grandmother, who is not just a baker, but a cake artist, I think, in Guyana. And Erica DeFreitas was using her grandmother's artistry and skill in making these beautiful cakes as a way to talk about what we carry and what we lose, those traditions we carry and lose when we talk about the migration experience. And in her particular case, it was from Guyana to Canada. So she made this beautiful series inspired by her grandmother, where that's her mother on the left and the artist Erica DeFreitas on the right, at least my left and my right. I don't know how it switched around for you all. And it's a series where you see just little by little the artist and her mother's face become completely engrossed in this icing mask. And it's speaking to a lot of things about loss and death, but also masking, you know, the sort of masks we wear in this migration experience. And the last artist, this is an installation shot in the center, is of Maya Makranbilal's work, who's an American-based artist, and her mother is Guyanese. And she was really thinking of sort of first migrations and thinking of the Indian migration to Guyana because of the system of Indian indentured labor. So again, similar to Christy, thinking about migration and labor. And so what Maya has done is made these series of what she called yogi mudras, but they all feature food as an object of migration. And this is a hasa fish, a very popular fish that we eat in Guyana, a sapodilla fruit, and a coconut. And what you'll notice is that all of them have been violently ruptured or punctured or pierced or split apart in some way. And what she's gesturing to is thinking about that rupturing, that violence inherent to migration. And so that's the book, those are some of the exhibitions. I've sped through it, but they're all online, the full catalogs. The book is open access. It's online for anyone to read the entire book. And so in addition to the books and the projects, we've also launched a social media online initiative called Guyana Modern. And this is the Instagram page where we're sort of archiving and cataloging a lot of these beautiful photography and visual art that are largely engaging with the migration experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Grace. Tiera, welcome.
Thank you, Aldeide. Well, I must say it's an honor to be here with this group today. And I'm really excited to share more about how I've been able to approach photography in the Caribbean, the diaspora, and the diaspora through my work and my general interest. So as I mentioned, I'm the founder of WOPHA Archives, which is a virtual archive platform on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, dedicated to sharing lesser-known histories of the Bahamas through photography. I'm also curatorial assistant at the Museum of Art in West Palm Beach, which means today I get to work alongside the museum's curators, to realize their schedule of exhibitions, which is about 15 shows in a calendar year. So that's been very exciting to join this role. So I studied art history and history at Emory University, and I've been using photography as a tool for historical discovery, as well as historical inspiration for about 4 years now. But of course, what do I mean by using photography as a tool for historical discovery? Well, let's take these next photos for example. Next slide, please. On the left, we have an image by a Brazilian photographer who took this while visiting Nassau in the Bahamas in the 1980s. On the right hand, we have an image taken by an American photographer, also while visiting Nassau, but this is from the early 1900s, 1901 to be exact. So in the typical way of storytelling with history, and now I'm kind of referring to when you're first introduced to history in grade school, right? You're given a textbook, you may have illustrations like these on the screen that complement a body of text. Sometimes a photo comes along every 2 pages, there's a handful in a chapter, but in that situation, the importance is really on the written text. The text is the first tool that you use to then educate, and the photographs are secondary, I think, in this traditional approach. But for me, in my platforms and my curatorial work, I try to subvert that. I start first with the photographs and then educate. And that's a minute shift, but the depth of that change, I think, is quite influential. In the same way that oral history can expand the kinds of stories we can learn, stories that aren't necessarily making it into the Western canon of history. For me, I see the same happening when I approach history with this kind of photocentric eye. These are the stories of our ancestors, that those in power in the past, those that had the authority to write the history books. These are oftentimes the stories that ruling class didn't care to listen or include or to document. So when we start with the images first as the tool, I think it's a way that we can unlock these stories. So I just want to highlight some instances that I think WOPHA Archives has been really successful to help unearth these lesser known stories and also spark an interest in Bahamian history. Next slide, please. So these images are taken from Tony Casaro's personal archive of the first Independence Day celebrations for the Bahamas in July 1973. As I'm sure many who are tuning in, who are from nations that are now Commonwealth countries, you know that the standard inaugural independence celebrations are full of visits from the royal family, who kind of come and bestow their good wishes on a newly formed parliamentary system or now majority ruled parliament system. That's what the pictures from that time will focus on. I know it happened surely in Jamaica, who had Princess Margaret for their visit. It was certainly the case for the Bahamas. We had Prince Charles. But what's left out in that traditional history, and I think what's rediscovered in these grouping of images, is how that day was celebrated and experienced by Bahamians, and more so by Black Bahamians. Next slide, please. So these are May Day festivities in Tarpon Bay, Eleuthera in the early 20th century. On the left, you can see early forms of Junkanoo costumes. And what we now know in the Bahamas, at least with Bahamian Junkanoo, is far more extravagant displays. There's feathers and glitter. And if you're not familiar with Bahamian Junkanoo, you can, if you know Trinidadian Carnival, it's a very similar celebration. But these costumes that you see on the left, I think show more clearly the lineage and connection of Junkanoo that we see across the African diaspora. So I'm thinking of, in Jamaica, in the Carolinas, and Belize, this kind of rich African heritage tradition. And the image on the right features the maypole, which is kind of the symbol, I think, of nostalgia for many, but also just an illustration of the depth and the breadth of like British influence on our nation. I'm actually not sure if this is still an activity in grade school. I don't think my school had it, but still a really interesting snapshot and different perspective of our history. Next slide, please. So last thing kind of for Baja Archives, I always love sharing this story. These photographs are from the Life magazine archive. They were never published, but they were taken as journalists were investigating a murder at sea. And I should say that none of these men are suspects, but rather they're fishermen in Sandy Point, Abaco, which was the last port that the family who was later murdered was seen. So if you can kind of imagine with me back in the 60s when this happened, these investigators from Life magazine traveled to Abaco, and they're here now questioning Jimmy Wells, who you see on the far left, and his peers. They're probably questioning them about the family's behavior to see if anything seemed off. They held their interview, took the photos, and then left. But when the story was published, Jimmy Wells and his peers, these men were never cited in the story. But here they are, kind of awkwardly dangling in what I think is like historical purgatory. They're part of this larger investigation. They were there. They were considered important to interview, but they're erased now from what's publicly been written and shared. And I think also kind of on a personal note, I love true crime stories. So I stumbled upon this and I was like, I have to share it to Instagram. Of course, highlighting this like air of mystery around it. And I thought others would like it too. But what I didn't think would happen, within a few hours, I got a DM from the grandson of Jimmy Wells, the man that you see seated on the left. And in this DM, he told me that his granddad never shared the story with him. And that, can you imagine, as a direct descendant, not hearing the story from your grandfather's 20s, late 20s. He also mentioned that this was the first time he'd seen photographs of his granddad at that age, like this post that he just randomly saw on Instagram. But he did say that he called his grandfather, questioned him, why'd you never share this? This is so cool. And though Jimmy had neglected to share before, upon seeing this grouping of images, he was kind of overwhelmed with the memory, super eager to share again, eager to speak on, you have to think about it, eager to speak on what Life magazine had intentionally omitted, what they had erased. So I kind of allowed the family to process all this privately, but, I did ask that I share this general gusto of the story because the whole situation for me really solidified like why I do what I do with Baja Archives. Because these photographs that I find and share can help fill the archival gap, but also the gaps in personal history. And I think that's just as important. And again, they give us a tool to continue exploring history. I just wondered what would happen if I didn't approach the photography first, if I'd only based my knowledge of the situation and this event on the written article. I mean, Jimmy Wells wouldn't even exist per se. Next slide. And kind of on that note, wanted to shift to what I do here at the Norton and how I take my personal passions and what drives me with Baja Archives to work every day. This is an installation shot of the show that I curated, Origin Stories, Photography of Africa and its Diaspora. It's currently on view at the Norton. It's been extended to July 4th. So if you're in South Florida and wanting to visit, please do. The show features works from the Norton's photography collection by celebrated artists across the diaspora, such as Yinka Shonabare, whose work is on the right wall, that monumental ship composition. Next slide, please. And then we have the work of Anna Mendieta on the left, as well as some of Carrie Mae Weems's work on the right. Next slide. Also featured quite prominently in the show is Adama Delphine Fawundu. And the motivations of her work really lie in exploring the ebbs and weaves of the diaspora and how it connects to African traditions. And I think it's so parallel to the curatorial intent of this exhibition. Next slide, please. So this is just me speaking with a Black student union at a local high school. And so this has been an exciting turn for my curatorial kind of career. And while I'm doing similar things here at the Norton as I do with WOPHA Archives, as a curator at a public institution, I'm now able to reach so much like a wider group of people. And that's what's really exciting for me, to be able to bring artists and artworks kind of out of this collection. There's a treasure trove here at the museum. I think there's over 10,000 objects in total, but to be able to bring them out to this Palm Beach County community. And also, you know, while Baja Archives was kind of born out of this desire to curb erasure in the Bahamas at the museum, I'm reminded that this isn't an exclusively Bahamian issue at all. And I know I don't have to say that everybody here knows that as well, but it just cemented, you know, that this is something for us all and all parts of the diaspora to tackle. And I think, you know, when I speak for myself, certainly, and I hope also for my fellow panelists, when I say that photography really is the most efficient tool to use to address these issues. That's all from me. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much, Tiera. I want to repeat to the audience, the people that are watching us, that please, if you have any question, you can write them in the comment section. And then I want to start taking as a reference some of the ideas that Tiera mentioned during her presentation, and thinking as well in the connections that we can find in the several places in the Caribbean. So I want to ask you, what are your ideas regarding how photography history from the Caribbean is being taught, is being exhibited, or is being published? Yeah, that's the first question.
I guess I can tackle it first. Sorry, I didn't know if it was directly for me. I think that certainly with contemporary photography, I see a lot of connections back to this like historical, like almost a revisionist history. And that's been really exciting to see artists confronting this past.
Yeah, and in your experience, because you graduated like I think last year or something like that.
Yes.
So did you had in your, because for example, my experience in Cuba was where I didn't have photography history include as part of the curriculum of art history. So that's in your experience as professors or were even as a cultural producers in your context, how was that approach to photography history from the university, from the academy, and what were the conditions that sparked your interest in doing this kind of work centered in photography?
Yeah. So actually at my university, they didn't have a concentration in photography either. I don't think it was much more of my independent research that led me there. Because I don't think that we had even a course really. It's like me and my mentor reading things and learning things at the same time. But I got engaged and I was kind of interested in it. I worked with the archives at the university, and they were digitizing a number of photographs. And then I was kind of tasked with doing the research behind it. And that's when I kind of unlocked this idea of like, oh, there's all these stories in this one photo that haven't even really been documented concisely and all together. I'm kind of pulling all the pieces. So that's where I got interested and did a deep dive. But I think, they didn't have much in the academy in terms of the university curriculum. It was much more piecemealing through the library.
Yeah. And Grace, do you have any comments on that? Being a professor?
Yes.
Well, from a scholarship perspective, I'm always still amazed that of the work that still needs to be done. And Nadia was gesturing to this in her talk to counter the picturing paradise overwhelming narrative of the region. I mean, we're still sort of in that work, we're still in that phase, and there's some incredible artists that are both countering, pushing back against that picturing paradise overwhelming narrative of the region. There's some of them that are just right out exploiting it and leveraging it to push another narrative. And so in a lot of ways, the conversation, the scholarship, the work is still in that place. But it's always a reminder to me, Trinidadian artist Christopher Cocher has this beautiful quote that I always circle back to in my work, which is, what does it mean to be born in a place that other people see as a site to play in, right? And that is the continued tension in the work that all of us from that region continue to do, that we know that these are real people with real lives, with real disasters, but also real joys. It's not just disasters, but it's also real joys. And yet the global perspective on the region is this picturing paradise motif. And so there's been some great work to push against that, but there's still so much work that needs to be done in that area.
Nadia, sorry. Nadia, you want to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I guess for me it's a little bit different in the sense that I'm obviously not associated with the institution, or do I come from any sort of formal training in photography. But the way I just sort of approached it was just thinking about like what my day-to-day experiences were and why I wasn't seeing those images circulating. And I kind of use that as a starting point for the work that I do usually. It's like, well, these are the types of images that I see. So how can I do the opposite of that? I mean, that's literally it, and it's difficult because the frame of reference we have, it's inundating. Like we see the tourism images ourselves. Like it's really hard not to fall into that narrative yourself when you're creating. You're always gonna reach out for the beautiful scene of the beach, or there's certain things that are always gonna pop up. So you have to also check in with yourself as an artist and see how you can challenge that narrative in your work as well.
Yeah, that's why I consider that when thinking about our projects, the work that we do and how we are impacting, for example, in several areas, in the schools, how we are preparing exhibition, organizing exhibitions, or doing publications, I'm always thinking on that next generation. And for example, what are the information that is being that is being offered to the students in academy, and in that sense, how we are teaching photography and what is the paradigm. And in that process of, as I said, like rewriting or reframing that history of photography, putting at the center where Caribbean history, but what does it mean? I was, in this sense, I have been considering this idea that Ariela Zulay proposed in thinking about the origin of photography, not when the device was invented, but going back to the 1492 with the encounter of the Americas. And then, this is a very radical idea, but also makes me think that establishing like the beginning of where modernity and colonialism and what does it mean for the Americas, and being that happening that in the Caribbean, where what is the role of photography in all of that construction. And in that sense, I think that our approach or studying photography or how we can challenge what people are seeing is crucial. I know that we don't have too much time, and I had like many questions. I have many questions, but I also want to ask you about what do you consider is the current status, the current situation for women in photography. And in that sense, what can we, what are the next, what can we do for better inclusivity, or how, still we know that there is a lot of work that needs to be done, but where do you consider are the main areas that needs more exploration?
Is that a question for me or?
Yeah, for all of you.
Okay. I mean, I can say as like a woman starting off in this field, I mean, I think most women photographers say the same thing. It's like kind of like the battleground of dealing with men. Um, more from a technical standpoint, it's like always that kind of pushback that you don't understand the equipment, you don't have the right kind of knowledge to tackle this. So I think having that sort of like educational background and just how a camera operates, like understanding technique, composition, color, all these types of things can be quite helpful to women. But also, I mean, that's obviously not just what photography is about. Like being able to like instill a kind of a critical understanding of how to approach photography in the Caribbean, like not just like limiting it to saying, well, this is the type of photography you can get into. You can do weddings or events or fashion, and not saying that those things don't have a place, but really trying to build a understanding of how to think of work in a very conceptual way, how to develop ideas beyond what we normally see. So yeah, I think that's like the best way forward. And there's also like women to just be more gutsy about it and just like not have to like think about what men think about you, in the field. Just push through. And I think when we operate as a unit, it's a lot easier to do that than an individual trying to push through it alone.
Yeah, I think, Nadia, you have mentioned in the past, and that's something that when you are speaking about, what does mean for a woman to approach photography in this specific context. And I remember one time that you mentioned that you felt that your practice was quite isolated. How, I remember where even with the Congress, I was speaking a lot about this idea of creating communities, creating networks, even this notion of archipelagos is about creating that kind of constellations, or trying to activate a community. And how, for example, through the work of WOPHA, I can create other opportunities for artists, to be seen. And being, having this conversation in the context of an art fair, maybe you can speak as well about what are the main challenge for you as an artist living in and working in St. Vincent, and how, how even have been the process of getting a gallery for you have been, and creating like a market for your work, and being able to work of, receive earning from your practice.
Yeah. I mean, I guess like, the biggest way to amplify your voice and your ideas is through social media, especially like being in a small place like St. Vincent. I don't have the community of people to give me that kind of critical feedback on what I do. I mean, I've been lucky to have the opportunity to travel and meet people and build those kind of connections. But, then I come back home and like I have to deal with the reality of like standing in line at Massey to get groceries like everybody else. You know what I mean? Like, so it's just like doing like the ordinary things day to day. But I mean, in terms of like building a community of people, I would encourage like other artists to really utilize social media in healthy ways to kind of nurture those connections, because they do make a difference, and you don't know where things can kind of take you with that. But no, I mean, having that community has been critical. Like being in Trinidad, like speaking to Chris, having like a community of like-minded artists is really valuable at the end of the day. And I think just kind of also because I noticed you guys, mentioned ARC as well in my bio. It's like that was also kind of a critical moment for me, being able to like usher together all these people in the Caribbean doing different types of work and learning about them and building those communities. And I think that's all that we can really do right now. I mean, it's gonna be limiting for a while to travel and connect in the ways that are really important to us. But we just kind of have to find ways to work with what we have until we can do otherwise.
Yeah. Yeah, Grace, Tiera, do you want to mention something about what do you consider is the current status of women in photographic arts, the studies or the approaches? How do you see this field progressing or no?
Well, I think it's always important to acknowledge that women aren't doing anything differently that men aren't doing. You know, what's the definition of women's issues? Do we care about the economy? Are we invested in climate activism and climate change? Are we thinking about migration? I mean, just in terms of the work that I do, now more than ever, women are migrating more than men. And that's a historic, monumental, important moment to acknowledge. And so to engage with issues around how art responds to migration, how photography responds to migration, and to center the fact that women are at the forefront of migration, that's incredibly important to acknowledge. That when we talk about what women's issues are, when we talk about what women photographers and women artists are responding to, they're responding to everything critical that men are responding to. And so I always bristle at, you know, this notion of women's work or women's issues. I did a whole curatorial project on what is the definition of women's work? Well, frankly, it's everything. It's everything. And so I think there's room to be more embracing and open about what women's issues are, what women's photography is, what women's art is, what women's work is. And frankly, it's pretty much everything.
Tiera?
Very well said, Grace, I think. And I agree. Absolutely. And I agree with kind of Nadia's point too. There's much more work to be done, but I think, you know, it's a good place to begin with the things that we are doing. With the WOPHA conference, I think of, you know, not having something like that and it now having it and looking forward to future editions is really exciting.
Thank you. I want to also thinking on the title of the book, on your book, Grace, Liminal Spaces, and thinking on that in relationship with Nadia's work. Something that what really fascinates me about the work of Nadia is how she captures like this moment of transition, of moment in which something is going to happen. While I was reviewing your work or seeing your work during this week, preparing for this talk, it was interesting because your side is not, you know, your perspective is not from the Iceland. I mean, if you were in the mainland, in the land, but you are from the sea. So it's that I think there is I was thinking also in this idea of how important is geography and the process of mapping from many artists in the Caribbean. I mean, we have in several exhibitions that we have seen or we have organized that that practice that is about remapping or trying to locate what is the Caribbean, to which region we are referring to is very common. But then when I was seeing your work, it came to me this notion of time. And in that sense, I want to ask you, even we working with archives, or how are we dealing with this notion of time, or if you have any ideas in that regard?
Myself or Grace? Any?
Yeah, any of you, you can
Okay.
go.
You know, I mean, I guess the geography and the geology is important. Obviously, Guyana is, you know, part of the continent, and some instances, an island dropped in the middle of the ocean. So I think our awareness of our isolation takes on a very different form. And, you know, photography is about your position in relation to something else, whether you're photographing land or a person or whatever. You always, there's always a space between you and what you're photographing. And I think that's one way that you kind of compress time, just thinking of that positionality and where you are. And I guess for me, it's really, yeah, I think that awareness of the sea has always been a part of my work in some way, because what it doesn't matter what you're photographing, like it doesn't matter where on the island you stand, like there's always a point that you can see the ocean. So I'm constantly reminded of where I am and how difficult it is to get out there. So I think I've kind of used that as a way to, one, I mean, pass the time, but that idea of liminality and transitioning, I mean, something is always on the edge of happening in these spaces, right? We think like nothing really goes on an island. You always see like old people on the side of the road just kind of looking, waiting for something exciting to happen, because something will happen. Like events unfold, whether they're like catastrophic or like minute. So I guess for me, it's just about like what is the event that's about to unfold? What is between me and the event about to unfold? And a lot of times it's a very monotonous thing that occurs. And I think when I think about liminality, I think about that. It's just like a moment of stillness between the event and my experience.
Yeah, I love that. Yeah. Um, well, I think also another important element for our work, and you have been speaking about that, is activism, and even in the way in which, for example, you, Nadia, have been creating. I mean, I love to see how your photograph really serve as this documentary material that effectively provoke the suspension of this development project that would have been otherwise impact negatively in the natural ecosystem of the beach. And then if we think as well in the work of Grace and creating these wonderful programs that also I would love if you want to mention the programs in where the Caribbean, the Afro-Caribbean fellowship that you have organized, or even this series of curatorial conversation that also have centered cultural producers for the Caribbean during the last years. That's a project that you have been doing, or Guyana Modern, or Tiera with these Baja archives. I want to ask you, I mean, this activist role of ourselves is manifested creatively, but also through the creation of these platforms. So my question for each of you will be, in the case of Nadia, how do you define your role as an artist in the society? And then for Tiera and Grace, how do you define your role within the institutional spaces?
I think for me it's how do I present information to the public in a way that's not going to shy them away from confronting it. I think especially now in the social media era, like we're bombarded with a lot of imagery that people just put up walls, right? I mean, some people are engaged and want to know, but a lot of people don't want to know. And I think for me, it's like, how can I present something to the public or whoever in a way that's deceptive initially? Because I mean, you can look at the images and say, oh, this is a beautiful moment, and then, but there's a lot of layers of stuff going on behind it. And I think for me, I just want to like pull people into that moment first, and then, kind of like enrapture them in all that, and then really kind of get their brains thinking, and then hoping that the images can also serve as an archive and something much more useful. It might not be today. I mean, today might not be. It might not be useful. Maybe in 10 years, an event can happen, and then suddenly, these images can become a frame of reference for something much more important. So I try to approach my practice in that way now.
I would agree with your point, Nadia, about kind of wanting to show, for me, it's the history and these lesser known stories, and introduce them to people and not have them feel like, oh, this is information overload, but to instead make them want to think more about their own role in history and the things they can do, and kind of using the past as a way to inspire what their possibilities could be, what they can go on to do in the nation. And I think I do that also with, I say that for Baja Archives primarily, but similarly with my curatorial work here at the Norton. I mean, I'm going to be organizing a show for Moroccan female photographer Lala Sadi in the coming months. And so I think for me, yeah, that just got approved. So it's like, yay, it's happening. But being able to show her history and highlight like her womanhood and her story with a larger community so that it sparks that interest with them.
For me, a big part of curatorial activism, and that's something we talk a lot about, Aldeide. A big part for me of curatorial activism is the scholarship. And so after we do the show and the show comes down, what lives, right? What lives in the world? And the scholarship lives in the world. And that is a space that I think very critically about, and I've been really committed to being intentional about, the scholarship, who I'm writing about, and who are the women that I want to put on the page, and what do I want to say about what these women are doing or have done. And so I've been thinking really critically about and intentionally about the scholarship as a form of activism, and what writing can do in terms of elevating the stories of these women, particularly women and women communities that are largely under the radar.
Yeah, thank you so much. I don't know if any of you would like to make any question to each other. Please don't feel that I am the only one that makes questions here. Well, do you have any question for each of you or no?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, so I think we are, it's 1:15, well, 1:16 that we have, completed with our time for this discussion. And I want to thank you a lot for being in this panel. And of course, this is, I always speak about how important it is for me to engaging in these conversations, but in a long-term format. I mean, we are all collaborating in several projects, and we will continue working together. So what I encourage all the people that are watching us is to follow the work that we are doing. You have spoken about how important is social media in this process of redefining or trying to reimagine how an archive or how an exhibition can work. And in that sense, please follow us on our social media and subscribe to our newsletters and keep updated about all the work that we are doing, because, well, it's phenomenal, and I am very proud of being part of many of the initiatives that you are doing, and continue collaborating and working together.
Thank you, too. I wanted just to jump in because that question regarding how do we capture what has happened feels very much like what we're doing right now. Is that this film becomes a film, right? It lives on YouTube, and we hope becomes part of the sort of the archive and catalog of what we did and created for and responded to and spoke about related to the Atlantic World Art Fair 2022. So I want to thank you all again for your time and sharing. And I did actually, while we were speaking, I logged on and Instagram and connected to Guyana. And so more things will follow. But yeah, thank you again. And I hope this is the beginning of more conversations.
Yes.
Congratulate you all with your work. It's really terrific. And the way that you have all spoken so eloquently about your projects, it's been very engaging. I've enjoyed it thoroughly.
Thank you.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.